This is the Human Action Podcast with your host, Jeff Deist.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Human Action Podcast. As you can see, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy. We also have a special guest with us today, Robert Arro. Now, many of you are going to know his name from Mises.org. He is one of our bloggers who specifically covers the Fed. So when the Fed has a hearing before Congress, when the Fed has a press conference, also those FOMC minutes, which are very boring and none of you want to read, Robert goes in there and digs around and really gets to the nitty-gritty of what the Fed is doing day in and day out. He's also working on our master's program at the Mises Institute. So if you want to reach out to him for more info about that or his experience in that, you can find him on Twitter at Econ Circus, all one word, Econ Circus. So I suggest you follow him and just go to Mises.org and press on the blog button at the top left, and you can really keep up with everything Robert's doing for us. So all that said, gentlemen, we've spoken offline about our topic today. On this show and at Mises.org more generally, we talk a lot about central banking. We don't talk so much about central bankers. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to have a show dedicated to these people, these mysterious elites, these technocrats that seem to be loved and hated at the same time, who seem to have so much of our fortunes in their hands, or maybe they don't. It just depends on how you look at it. So, guys, let me start with this. Why don't we start at the head, Jerome Powell. All right, here this guy is, first of all, born in D.C., Who's born in D.C., right? Nobody's born in D.C., a very bad sign. He's a lawyer. He goes to Georgetown Prep. I know all of you went to Georgetown Prep or St. Albans or one of these kinds of schools, right? None of you went to public schools. He goes to Georgetown Prep. He goes to Princeton. He goes back to D.C., goes to Georgetown Law. Very smart guy, becomes editor-in-chief of Law Review, ends up working at white shoe law firms like Davis Polk, then transitions over to some very white shoe investment banking firms like Dillon Reed. He ends up at the infamous, I would consider evil, Carlyle Group, starts his own fund called the Global Environment Fund, which is kind of a BS precursor to ESG stuff. And again, is a lawyer, not a PhD economist. A lot of people might not know this, but the era of PhD economists at the Fed really didn't start till 1970. With Arthur Burns appointed by Richard Nixon. So prior to that, we'd had mostly lawyers. So this idea that everyone is a PhD economist is actually something we can talk about in a bit here, but that's new. So, looking at this guy, very smart, not the best public speaker, I might add. He's got a lot of ums. Do you guys have this? Is he in over his head? He's clearly not the kind of person who is intimately familiar with the day-to-day toils of Americans in places like Iowa, I would venture.
Right. So I guess I'll jump in first. And Robert, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. I think you're right, Jeff. So just a little bit of the context in terms of Fed policy. So under Bernanke, they kept talking about a taper. He just started doing it a little bit when he handed the reins over to Janet Yellen. She oversaw that, and then under Powell is when the Fed's balance sheet really did start shrinking significantly. But then, of course, all that went out the window when the coronavirus panic hit. And so, I think you're right, Jeff, that Powell does convey this more like, hey, I'm a real guy. I'm not one of these wonky people. Not that he's, salt of the earth. And I know the struggles when you're trying to make ends meet and running a household, of course, but that he is more, he's speaking more plain English. And I've had other people who have no, they're no fans of Powell, but say I can at least listen to his news conference or press conferences and know what the heck he's saying. So I think he probably had some sense that, what the Fed was doing under, Bernanke was kind of crazy, but yet when they get in there, I think it's the sort of thing, if you're coming from the banking sector, you can't just let all your buddies get destroyed. And so maybe if we have time during this episode, we'll circle back and talk about Bernanke, because there was this other dichotomy with him in terms of the academic Bernanke versus what he did as a central banker. And I think it's the sort of thing, if it were a person that we're going to let all the big banks go down, they would never find themselves as chairs of the Fed in the first place. So, whether it's a corrupt deal or just the people know, who's the kind of guy or woman that we want in there who plays ball, maybe that's the phenomenon.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I read pretty much everything he says, and it's kind of just, I think he's just kind of a point man or someone who's just meant to execute or just to say the narrative. And a lot of times he does kind of speak off the cuff, and you'll get things where he says something like, poor people are just prone to suffer, or some people are just prone to suffer. And you get all sorts of just wild, almost outlandish statements from time to time. I think it's probably just a job, right? He wakes up, he does his job. He probably doesn't think about the bigger picture. And I don't know if the name's, Mises Rothbard. I don't know if, I just don't know. Has he ever even heard of that? Is that a thing, or it's it's not even in his periphery? And I always struggle with that too. I always wonder, behind closed doors of the Fed, are they laughing at us and they know exactly what they're doing, or do they actually believe, the Phillips curve and we need some liquidity for the market and aggregate demand and all these notions? They actually believe. I struggle with that often, and I can't tell you if I know the answer.
Well, a few years ago, we had an event where James Grant was one of our guests. And I asked him that very question. I said, are these Fed people, are they true believers, or are they just sort of doing what they need to do while they pad their Swiss bank accounts and plan their exit? That's kind of an unpleasant question. But I will say this. I'm sure you guys are both familiar with Danielle DiMartino Booth. She worked for a period at the Dallas Fed. She told me privately that Jerome Powell's a very smart guy, scary smart, and that when he was being considered for Fed chair, he really ramped up and read very quickly a lot of material. Her opinion was that he's probably familiar with Mises, at least tangentially. Wouldn't know Rothbard necessarily, but when we look back, Alan Greenspan was so opaque. He was just a master at giving these 300-word paragraph answers that said nothing. And everyone had to go scratch their head and say, oh my gosh, what does he mean? Should I buy a stock or a house or whatever? And Bernanke was not as skilled, I would say, if the goal is to obfuscate. I would say Bernanke was less skilled, but Powell doesn't have that at all. He seems to just speak very plainly.
Right. And just on the issue of, whether they're smart in the general sense, to me, so yes, it does raise red flags for me if they're coming, from the banking sector, and they've worked for these large, major international banks and such, in terms of the policies presumably are going to favor their. And again, it doesn't even need to be completely corrupt with guys smoking cigars in back rooms, even though it could be that. But it's just more, you're the kind of person coming from that environment. It's just inconceivable to you that you would oversee, the destruction of household names and things like that. But beyond that, to me, it's whereas academics, like somebody, let's pick on my favorite nemesis, Paul Krugman. I mean, he's very intelligent in a certain sense, but in another sense, he's completely clueless. And I'm not saying that just to be funny or something. Like I really do mean that in certain academics, or like Paul Samuelson famously kept updating his textbook and thinking the Soviet Union was going to overtake the U.S. right until the very near end of the collapse of the country. So clearly, if you're coming from academia, you can be intelligent but really miss certain things. Whereas if you're in the private sector making loans or overseeing acquisitions and things like that, you kind of have to have some common sense at least and know how the world works. It doesn't mean you're moral, obviously, or that what you're going to do is going to help humanity. But I do think there's a more presumption that you kind of understand different factors and how they relate if you're coming from the private sector.
Robert, do you think Powell has street smarts?
It's hard. It depends. He's smart to make a success of himself, right? He became, net worth of $50 million. So, he can get it done. He can make money. He can make connections. See, when I think of street smarts, I think of streets, right?
Right. Right. Literally.
And I always take offense because Powell, I notice he says a lot of the times about, blacks and minorities and poor people and this. And to me, he's speaking to the streets, but I mean, as far as, blacks or minority or just poor, even, poor white people, poor everyone, right? I mean, the Fed, it has to be the number one cause of poverty in my book, right? So then when they say things like the discrepancy between, the poor and the minority, it just always rubs me the wrong way because he's not really in tune to what the average American even or person is struggling with. So I always find it somewhat offensive or even humorous, right?
Well, let's talk about the contrast then between him and Bernanke. I had a few dealings with him working for Dr. Powell during those years. As a matter of fact, he had breakfast with Ron personally one time simply because Ron sat on the Financial Services Committee and the Fed chairs made it, a practice to try to get to know them and have some outreach. And so Ron can tell you a little bit about that breakfast, which was apparently polite but a little stilted. Bernanke was a very different animal than Powell, I think. I mean, more of a pure wonk. Another brilliant guy, but Powell seems more, more like an investment banker.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, that's exactly why. Well, as far as once, I've been talking the last few months or writing about, as soon as the market crashes, I think the Fed is going to reverse course, in a heartbeat. It's not even a question. And he recently wrote how they're going to raise until, they tamed inflation. But I just can't see that because I refuse to believe that, say a year later, you're going to have rates at, 3.5, 4%, $1 trillion reduced from the balance sheet. I mean, in my book, I think if we can make it till October, if we can make it 5 months of tapering, I think that's the best we can get. I can't see how, like you said, all his, their stock investments, Nancy Pelosi's portfolio. I just can't see how that can all go to ruin, right? So I guess we'll see.
Yeah, let me just mention a few things. Yes, the contrast, again, Bernanke was an academic, and you really see that, and this was what was funny to me at least. So as an academic, he wrote on, I don't know if it was his dissertation or not, but what he was known for was his analysis of the Great Depression and how it was, extending Milton Friedman's analysis and conclusion, saying that the Fed was just too timid there, and there was a power vacuum because the head guy died and whatever, and in the late 1920s, and the Fed didn't inflate enough. Because when the banking panics ensued and the public was taking their money in the banks, the Fed needed to pump in even more money to more than compensate. So that was Milton Friedman's hypothesis. The reason the 1930s, or at least the initial contraction, was so bad was that the Fed was asleep at the wheel. Of course, the Rothbard and other Austrians say it's the Fed inflated too much in the 1920s, and that's what caused the asset bubble. But what was interesting is and then also with Bernanke's analysis of what the Bank of Japan should have been doing in the 90s. And then that's where he got the nickname Helicopter Ben, he was again saying when you're in a situation that you want to just flood the market with liquidity, and that's how you get out of this kind of a rut. And so then when in office, when the financial crisis hit, and then Bernanke, a lot of people don't know this, I'm sure Mises.org followers do, but it was in the fall of 2008 that the Fed started paying interest on reserves. So the way I like to describe it is the Fed began paying commercial banks to not make loans to their customers. Like that's one way of putting it. And it was hilarious was all these guys like Scott Sumner and everybody, they were scratching their heads saying, why is Bernanke doing this? I mean, as an academic, he knows the last thing in the world he wants to do right now is to have a contractionary policy put into place. And yet, so to me, that was just kind of funny. Like, gee, why would the head of the Federal Reserve be, giving money to bankers all of a sudden when they're in trouble? I'm just baffled, because he has academic papers saying you shouldn't do that. This is and they, you know what I mean? Like it was just they were trying to come up with like some theoretical mechanism in which, as opposed to, well, again, like I go back to my earlier point, maybe the reason he was sitting in that position was they knew he was the kind of guy that would do that if push came to shove.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert,
it's kind of also like how Greenspan, because I remember he had a very famous essay about, the gold standard and the importance of gold. And then once he gets in there, he does the 180. So I don't know. There's something just about the magic of that building that turns people's heads or makes them forget what they wrote.
Right. Because even with Bernanke, once he left office, I don't know if you call it office, once he left that position and was, back, he had some plush job. And that's instantly, too, how people explain that mechanism. They kind of know if they do the right things, they're going to have a nice consulting position afterward. And so it doesn't have to be they literally, get money under a park bench or something that some guy drops off in a paper bag. And so, he became sensible again, right? So Bernanke pre and post Fed was actually a decent economist, but when he was in there, he was doing inexplicable things.
Yeah, well, they tend to do all right in life after their Fed career is over. But, you bring up interest on reserves. Of course, that was actually passed by Congress. That was accelerated into 2008. But that was interest on excess reserves. And as we know now, they're just paying interest on reserves, period, which are fat and happy, by the way, because basically since 07 or 08, successive rounds of quantitative easing asset purchases from commercial banks by the Fed, they have lots and lots and lots parked at the Fed in their accounts. So our friend Miss Shedlock actually published something the other day about how the interest rate on reserve balances has been raised to 0.9%, just below 1%. And given the current state of bank reserves at about $3.875 trillion at the Fed, that's going to yield about $34-something billion in interest paid to commercial banks. So that could have sent some baby formula to Ukraine right there, $35 billion. But instead, we'll just send those over to the commercial banks. But I want to talk a little bit more. I mean, Bernanke's a boring guy. I mean, Greenspan's far more interesting and far more inscrutable. Of course, we all know famously his history. He started out as a trained musician. He went to Juilliard. I mean, Juilliard is where the best musicians train, and a clarinet, among other instruments, was a jazz musician. And, people forget this. He went back later in life in his 50s and actually finished his PhD at Bob's alma mater of NYU. And I remember, this is a while back, but I remember when Barron's, I believe, got a physical copy of Alan Greenspan's dissertation at NYU, which was a series of articles rather than one, central thesis, which is more common today, less common then. So this is like the 70s when he got his PhD, just maybe 10 years before Reagan made him Fed chair. So that's interesting. And of course, his article, Golden Economic Freedom, which you mentioned, that's probably one of the best short arguments for gold, persuasively written. It came out in the 60s, I want to believe. And it was part of the Ayn Rand Objectivist Club, or whatever they were called at the time. It was one of their newsletter articles, and then it ultimately found its way into the compendium. It's a series of articles called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal from Ayn Rand. So if you find that, you'll find his article. And interestingly, Ron Paul in the early 2000s asked him after a hearing if he would sign his copy of that book, the article within that book. And Ron said, what do you think of this now? And Greenspan said to him, I wouldn't change a word. So again, I think, Robert, your point is that, there are the sort of intellectual or academic angles to all this. There's the book learning. And then when they get into the job, there is the very real pressure, political, economic, of keeping this whole thing going. And so, these guys today, I don't think they're going to be celebrated the way Greenspan. Remember the Maestro, the biography that came out about him? I think these guys are, first of all, I think there are no Alan Greenspans. And second of all, I think they're going to find that they're up against it, especially with federal debt and when it comes to raising interest rates.
Yeah. I mean, things were easier back then, right? When the U.S. debt was $1 trillion, at 18% interest rate, it didn't matter as much, so to speak. But I mean, at $30.5 trillion, even 10%, 5%, I mean, it won't take much to effectively bankrupt the whole nation. Default mortgages across the country. I mean, there's just less wiggle room, right? As the debt builds. Inflation, pressures build. So, yeah, it's just not as easy as it once was, right?
Does that mean that because of the federal debt, among other topics, does that mean that these guys will never, ever, ever let interest rates go up again that high? I mean, obviously the market sets them, but push interest rates that high so that average people in America will never again be able to simply save in a simple money market or savings account at a rate at or above inflation?
I believe so. I believe that we're coming to a stage where there's going to be a choice where it's either we raise rates and you get all the negative consequences that come with that, or we keep rates low, but then we have to keep the money supply perpetually increasing, right? And if you look at history, hyperinflation, it's the norm, it's not the exception. And for them to let the free market reign and just let rates where they go, it will take a lot of restraint and just honesty that I don't think that they have. I don't think there's no one even on the Congress side, the Fed side. I just can't imagine a world where we can have even a 5% interest rate, other than a temporary spike that then they just paper over with issuing as much currency. But yeah, I think given the choice between high rates or essentially a currency collapse, I think it's a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, I agree that people talk about like, oh, we need a Volcker or something like that. And I think in some sense, Volcker is overrated in terms of what he did. But right, I agree with Robert, Jeff, that I think it would take an absolute crisis before they really did anything too serious. As you saw, Jeff, when we were down there in Orlando with that recent Mises event, and I was just going through and showing, I'll explain to the listeners right now, that the Fed, even though the markets have been doing terribly recently, the Fed really hasn't actually even tapped the brakes, right? Like in other words, they haven't begun selling off assets, or at least as of the last data point that I looked at, they had just stopped buying them. Yeah. And even in terms of raising rates, the yield curve is actually steepening because 10-year yields are rising more than 3-month yields. And so to me, what that means is just inflation expectations getting built in, that investors are implicitly raising like what the interest rates need to be, and the Fed's even behind that. So yes, raising rates is better than not raising rates in terms of tightening, but they're in a sense falling more behind the curve. And so my point is, if the financial markets are this sensitive just to the Fed kind of saying, hey, at some point pretty soon we're going to get serious, can you imagine if they actually did start tightening legitimately, what a bloodbath that would be? And again, I just think, so in a sense, it's not just that the debt is much higher now than in the late 70s, early 80s when Volcker came along, but also I think the financial markets, partly because of the so-called Greenspan put, have been conditioned to believe that, don't worry, the Fed's there to bail you out, nothing really bad's going to happen. Yeah. And so they just become addicted to that cheap debt.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I've done the math. Starting June, so June, July, August, they're supposed to reduce by 47.5 billion, and then in September and then on, it's 95 billion. So, like as I said, I just can't even picture October where you would have reduced by something like $350 billion, and interest rates would be 2% federal funds rate, and like you said, look at the stock market right now, without even $1 leaving the balance sheet. Now imagine $350 billion and interest rates twice as high in 4 months or 5 months from now. I mean. Yeah.
I mean, let me put it this way. The latest unemployment number, right, the official one is 3.6%, and inflation is 8.3, something like that. I mean, those numbers are crazy. That's not supposed to be, and yet the Fed is still timidly saying, well, we're going to start selling off assets really soon now. I mean, that's nuts given those two numbers. Again, so we all know the unemployment rate's really actually higher than that and all those tricks that they do. But I'm just saying in terms of their own playbook and what their strategy is, when price inflation is 6 points higher than it's supposed to be and unemployment is down at 3% and change, I mean, they should have been tightening a long time ago.
Well, so you mentioned Paul Volcker. His biography, his autobiography, which he was able to finish prior to passing away, he made it well into his 90s, is really fascinating. Of course, he's a fascinating character. We were talking about PhDs. Apparently, he had a master's in economics, but that's it. He's something like 6'7", and used to, of course, he was always famous for having the cigar and the ashtray at Fed meetings. So that shows you how different things were in his time. And again, as Robert points out, I mean, dealing with $1 trillion in debt was very, very different. But I just wonder today, with the midterms coming up, for example, and this is a little bit of convenient history. This is a little self-serving, but Volcker is portrayed as having stood up to Reagan and Carter somewhat, and not going along with their political aspirations necessarily, but wanting to do what had to be done to curb inflation, which back then was seen as raising rates. Do you think is there anything that Powell and company could do to try to help or save Biden with respect to the midterms? And if so, what might that look like?
It's tough. Yeah, I don't think there's much you could do other than just either maybe put the brakes on shredding the balance sheet. I wonder if they would just say something like, given the return of COVID or Ukraine or, formula shortages, maybe if they just tell the markets we're going to put the brakes on and just kind of hold the balance sheet steady, hold rates steady, maybe it would buy some time. Or I thought maybe they could just tinker with the inflation numbers to, more of a propaganda style level like the Soviet Union and just say, hey, inflation's going down, right? I mean, it's not that hard to, if they want 3% inflation, a statistician could give you that, right? It just takes a strong narrative.
It's about what you measure.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the relative importance of goods, right? So I mean, if cars just, if they say that they've just gone down in importance, that would help. So
it's going to be tough though, because I think they painting themselves into a corner. That, I mean, I just filled up my SUV yesterday and I paid $80. And I mean, I think a lot of people, they don't care what the government's telling them the inflation rate is. If gas is above $4.50, they know that's not right. So yes, it might be that the official 12-month increase in CPI starts edging down, and maybe it's down to 6% and change by the election, and they can claim, look, we're getting it under control. This crazy overheated economy Trump handed us, and Vladimir with his shenanigans or whatever. But I think people still, if they're just getting killed every time they fill up their car, and then if they want to accelerate that and they actually do start selling off the balance, I mean, and then cause a collapse in the financial markets, I mean, that's not good either going into election, to have Wall Street get crushed, even if, the average person isn't near retirement and, they don't, oh yeah, my 401k will recover. I mean, again, so I don't, there's a sense in which the Phillips curve in the short run is correct in that sense, that I think no matter which way they move right now, it's going to be painful, and they're just going to have to try to choose, what do we want? Do we want this price inflation to keep raging, or do we want to just crash the financial sector? And either way is not going to be great, because also the housing market could collapse. So that's another thing like normal people would care about, if all of a sudden, especially you're getting ready to move, and then all of a sudden your house drops 10%, that's not good either.
Well, with a 50 million net worth, it's hard to feel too sorry about Powell, but he's up against it. I think this is a very tough job. And if you notice in the Senate vote the other day to reconfirm Powell for another term, something like 80-20 or 83-17 or something like that. There were some interesting no's on that end. Mike Lee and Rand Paul, for example, voted no, but also some left progressives did. Ed Markey, if you know that name, senator from Massachusetts, Bernie Sanders voted no. So I thought that was interesting that it wasn't just, 95 or 97 votes in favor of Powell. So I thought that was worth noting. And, Lael Brainard had been floated as a possible replacement for him. She, much like Powell, came up in those settings. Her parents were diplomats, and she went to elite schools and everything. But she's been discussed a little bit. And, of course, she's a board member and also an FOMC member. What do we think about Lael Brainard?
Yeah, she would, I guess, be the progressive choice. I think she'd be tough because with her, there's some ideas that are banning about of, ESG or, a climate change Fed or a more progressive Fed. And, it's kind of hard. Just, it's one thing to talk about price stability and unemployment, but to add a new mandate of climate change and progressive or even wokeism, if it went to that far, I mean, yeah, that'd be a tough choice for sure. I mean, yeah, I still lament, Judy Shelton not getting her shots.
Well, I mean, talk about Judy Shelton. She was treated very shabbily. First of all, she was a Trump nominee to the board, so automatically she was attacked just for that. Plus, she had said and written some nice things about gold in the past, which is verboten at the Fed. And so this letter, which was signed by about 100 economists, a bunch of former Fed people, I think Stiglitz and some other Nobel Prize winners signed it. I thought it was really untoward, and also the fact that she came from, forgive me, I believe University of Utah. I hope it wasn't Utah State. I believe it was University of Utah, where she got a PhD in public administration. So, the idea that you could have real diversity on the Fed board in the terms of someone who's not from that warm, soft, womb-like embrace of the Ivies and the Northeast, that has a populist or a more pugnacious view of money and the economy, just for the diversity itself. I mean, I thought that was pretty shabby on the part of not only the economists who signed the letter, but also the financial media and their treatment of Judy Shelton.
Yeah, and even Mitt Romney, who is a Utah, I believe he's Utah senator, voted against her, and he's a Republican. So that I remember reading that, and that just took me made me upset, right? But yeah, the media treated her unfairly. I think even Schiller signed the letter. It was a pretty bold letter that people were just saying we just can't have this. It's I don't know. It was a whole new for someone that talks about diversity, inclusion, diversity, physical diversity. There's not that intellectual diversity, right?
Absolutely.
And it wasn't even for her to helm the Fed. It was just to be one member of a voting board, right? So I mean, that was a big error, and I remember it was Mitt Romney voted against that as a Republican. That was tough too.
It was funny, guys. I was just trying to look up, because I think for Mises.org, I had written something about a particular, I don't know if it was from that letter that was signed, but in general, yes, the financial, I want to say it was, like those guys who run Vox, or it was Ezra Klein. So it was somebody of that nature that was coming at her and just, correcting her with the most elementary, she claims this about the way things worked under the gold standard, but this is somebody said something like it would be hard to pack more error into two sentences, and they had a quote from her, and it was something, and then some pundit was taking that remark from a prominent economist and wrote a whole article. And in context, what she said was completely straightforward. So I was just trying to look that up, because I know I wrote that up for Mises.org, and I saw why the MSM hates Judy Shelton, and the author was Robert something, but it was a Robert Arrow piece. So I couldn't find mine, but
I mean, the other thing I love about her is that her and her husband live on a farm. That alone is when you think of a Fed board member, do you think of someone living on a farm? You probably don't. But again, they love Lael Brainard. And as far as this ESG stuff goes, and the progressive overlay, which is becoming part of central banking, I mean, this is more advanced in Europe. And maybe we should touch on Christine Lagarde. But the idea that central banks should take diversity and climate change and other social causes under their umbrella. We got the dual mandate with the Fed. Well, pretty soon it's going to be tripartite or four things or whatever it might be. I actually have a paper coming out in a European Journal of Ethics and Politics, and it's titled Evolution or Corruption, and it's about language. And so I have a whole section in the paper on woke central bankers and how they've started to weave in all this language about equity, where we used to use equality and so forth, and talking about climate change and talking about diversity. I mean, Lael Brainard's a female, and so she brings an element of it, but it's only a certain kind of female that they want, as we see with Judy Shelton. Now, any thoughts on Christine Lagarde? She always strikes me as the kind of woman that elites really celebrate, because they like to see a woman in charge and very accomplished and very well educated. But in many ways, I think she's been a disaster.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So again, this transition, like we said, from academics to people with more just standard experience. So for Mario Draghi, who was before her as the head of the ECB, he had a PhD in economics from MIT. He got it under Modigliani and Solo. So I mean, those are big names in that in that sector. He had been an academic professor, and then he went into more political things. He worked at Goldman Sachs, governor of the Bank of Italy, and then he was the head of the ECB from 2011 to 2019 before moving on to becoming prime minister. Whereas Lagarde, she has a law background. And so she was, went to law school. She became, she was like the first female, I don't know if the term was partner, but in terms of, looking through her pedigree, she had a lot of firsts for a female as she was going through stuff. French Minister of Finance, head of the managing director of the IMF, and then finally president of the ECB, started there in November of 2019. So she's, like you say, Jeff, being celebrated, does not have this wonkish background and more of a legal background. Even in the law, she was like focusing on antitrust and labor relations and things like that, as opposed to just, purely business relations. So I think you're right that there is this transition away from the academics. And so maybe this is all part of the same pattern, moving to people who have, there's more plugged into different organizations and they check the box on certain characteristics of, the first so-and-so. But even so, she still does have, like all these people, they have this, it's kind of like with the Klaus Schwabs, they're not like radical Marxists, that they still, in other words, certain purists on the left don't like Lagarde because they think she's too much about privatization of state assets and things like that. You know what I mean? So we as Austrian libertarians know they still want government control, but it's sort of a managed capitalism or what have you. But again, it's they are not radical activists either. And the same thing with Leonard. Like, she was at Brookings for a while too. So these people are not marching in the streets, power to the people. They are connected, politically connected, plugged in people, and I think they know the rhetoric to use in certain situations to make it look like they're fire-breathing radicals when they're really not.
Yeah, and I guess it shows you whether it is a man or a woman, or whether they're an academic or a lawyer. Ultimately, once you get that position of power, I mean, whatever you believe before that position has, it changes, right? And you're towing whatever the narrative or whatever the line is, or whoever's preparing these lines. I mean, you're executing them, right?
Well, and of course, Europe has its own version of the Ivy League, and there's a very depressing sameness to these central bankers. They all sort of come from the same elite background, the same schools. I mean, that's why, in a sense, Mario Draghi was at least Italian and a little pugnacious, and apparently enjoyed a cocktail or two from time to time, and sometimes even in public settings might have had a cocktail or two too many. I don't think you'll see that from Lagarde. This is a very measured person, and so these people come out of a mold. And, they have an internationalist or globalist viewpoint, which is fine in a sense. I think it's harmful in a very real sense. I think the ECB has been an absolute disaster for not just sovereignty in Europe, but also for the wealthier countries in Europe. I think the Germanys are subsidizing the Greeces as a result of this shared currency. And it causes a lot of problems when there's a turn down. You can't protect yourself the way Iceland was able to protect itself after its bank problems in 2008, because they still had the Icelandic kroner, which they could devalue against and let it float. If they'd had the euro, they'd have had a real hard time paying employees, for example, and getting unemployment under control. So there's a lot, a lot goes into this. But the Lagardes of the world, they're very committed globalists. I can't imagine that they see the world much differently than Jerome Powell does. But what's so depressing is that, anyone who's just slightly outside of that, like the aforementioned Judy Shelton, just seems to be treated as a pariah. And especially when we get into younger central bankers under 40, who are never going to really have known a true down market in at least in a nominal sense. People who until recently never knew real, heavy duty inflation. If you come up through the Dylan Reeds and the Carlyles of the world, if you come up through the Whartons and the Harvards and the Princetons and the Sorbones and the Oxfords, I mean, the kind of wokeism which Lael Brainard exhibits and professes is going to be imbued in everything central banks do. I think we have to prepare for that. And so, can they keep it together? I guess is the question I'll leave you to with. Can they keep it together? And number two is, how do we begin to think about unyoking ourselves from this system, because obviously it's fraught and it's also very immoral. And it's a huge driver of inequality and inflation and all kinds of suffering in the world. So can they keep it together, and how do we protect ourselves?
Okay, so I'll jump in. I think my guess is there's at least let's say a year before like utter collapse again, because like as I pointed out that Orlando event, Jeff, that the yield curve actually, even though it flirted with inverting, it's moving the other way at this point. So if history repeats itself, it would have to officially invert before a major recession hits. So in that sense, I think they do have a little bit more time, even though, for our point of view, if everyone thought like us, there'd be a huge crash immediately because everybody would see the writing on the wall. But yet I think a lot of people, they don't believe in economic law, or they just, they refuse to, it can't be that bad because if if the fundamentals are saying it's this awful, I just don't want to go down that path. And so they just, suspend their belief. And then all the woke stuff. Yeah, I think that is partly how they're buying more time for themselves, that they realize the jig is almost up. And so, yeah, we have to now, allow a bunch of people to come in who previously did not have seats at the table. And that's how we'll buy their silence for, another cycle. And, by giving, groups, activist groups now getting more play, they'll sort of subdue their criticism. Okay, like even with the CIA, how they're, people should go to YouTube and check it out if you haven't seen it. Even the CIA is openly showing now how they're recruiting people from different backgrounds and whatever. So, I mean, everybody's into this stuff. And I think it's partly because, they want to buy themselves some time to, as this stuff collapses.
Yeah. Robert?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think the jig is up, so to speak. You could fool people for a long time, but you can't fool them forever. And eventually, if people find that they just can't afford things like meals, if there's shortages, if America gets to that point, like I saw in an upcoming article, it said 1/5 of people in Britain, they skip a meal just because inflation pressures is so bad, right? And you get these little just cracks, and America, it's not going to end. The world will always turn, but I think we will at some point, whether it's this year or 5 years or by the next decade. I think we'll have to enter a new era, because essentially we're just living in an unsustainable time, and something has to give, right? Either we raise rates and we live with that, or we keep rates down forever and then we have to live with that. But we can't just stay in limbo, and the debt will grow and price will rise, people will get poorer, the income disparity will raise. I just think, I think they're just buying time, and whenever everything comes, the chickens come home to roost. I think if we, as the free market crowd, I think that would be our time to somehow move society, whether it's on the grander scale succession of states or some radical change. I think something will happen. So I think we're in the right area. I think we have the answer. The free market is the right answer. So I just hope that we can, as a society, just get as many people to understand that, and ultimately that would be the only real answer, would be a free market solution, for sure.
Well, I agree. I think there's going to be some sort of great reset for money. I think there's going to be some kind of debt jubilee. And let's face it, people who loan governments money ought to take a haircut on that bond debt. That's one approach. You loan money to psychopaths who can't stop spending. So there's going to be something. It'll probably be international, global, under the auspices of maybe the IMF. For example, James Rickards, author of Currency Wars, writes a lot about this. I recommend his stuff, although I don't always agree with him. And I think that no matter how you look at it, the United States comes out of all of this less powerful. I don't think the rest of the world is going to accept forever and ever that we just get to have king dollar and the world's reserve currency. I don't, that's not in the interest of the rest of the world. Even the Europeans, I think, are very much starting to see that. So all that said, again, I want to encourage people to follow Robert Arro at Econ Circus on Twitter. Follow Dr. Bob Murphy on Twitter, and we will be back next Friday with another show. So have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.